Well, ladies and gentlemen, today on No Nonsense, we are going to cover the waterfront. We're going to talk about public opinion polls. We're going to talk about what you all think about Christmas, what you all think about flying, and all sorts of other topics. Darrell Bricker, the CEO of IPSOS polling company, has been our guest many, many times, author of half a dozen best-selling national books. The most recent was Next. And he's an honorary colonel of the Queen's York Rangers, which I like to mention from time to time because he does his service on the side. And it's much appreciated, Darrell, that you keep doing that. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Senator.
So you went out to do some polling in the last little bit. What did you discover? Is there any buyer's remorse on the election results, or what are you sensing?
Well, I think Canadians are pretty much politicked out. I mean, they're not really into what's happening in Ottawa at the moment. They will be if the new variant starts to raise concerns again about COVID. But generally speaking, if that doesn't happen, I think that people are pretty much tuning out of what's happening in Ottawa right now.
So what you were finding, if I can put some words in your data, is that the inflation factor was starting to show. People were feeling the impact of the cost of living.
Yeah, and it really took off quickly. That's something that's interesting about this particular issue, because when we were asking it back in the election campaign, yes, there was concern about cost of living, which is what real people call inflation.
Right.
But now it's so when we pulled back in the election campaign, it was number 5. But today, when we ask people what's most on their mind, it's gone up to number 1. Now, given what's been happening with COVID lately, maybe something else has moved in front of it, but quite clearly people are feeling the pinch. Now, the difficulty, of course, from an analytical perspective is you'll get the people who are policy experts and economists and others will say, well, Canadians have never really been in a situation in which they've had more cash. I mean, they've been getting a lot of money from the government. People have been saving an awful lot. So why is it that they're feeling the pinch? Well, the pinch isn't necessarily what's actually happening to people. It's what they feel is happening to them. Yeah. And what they're feeling right now is financially precarious. And as a result of everything from rising gas prices, although that's been fluctuating recently too, the cost of groceries to everything else, the Canadian public is feeling like they're under a level of financial pressure that they haven't felt in some time.
There's a sense, though, and we're back in session in the Senate and the House and all the rest. And of course, everybody's talking about inflation because the prices are higher than they've been in 2 to 3 decades, depending on which item you're looking at. So this is very real. I mean, if you go and fill up your car, this is in fact very real, or buy something in the grocery store. But the government's response, they do, I mean, obviously the new variant, but they keep going back to COVID even before the new variant, or their answer for inflation or cost of living is, yes, but we're going to improve childcare. So that'll take care of that, or we're going to build new houses. But those programs are like 5 years out at a minimum.
Well, and they're also like public policy type expert analysis, as opposed to really what people are saying, which is this is kitchen table stuff. It's things it's the transactions that I engage in every day, not childcare and not housing costs. Yes, housing costs are a big part of it. If you've got children at home and you're paying a lot of money for childcare, definitely it's something that you're feeling a burden on, particularly if you're living in a place like downtown Toronto. But the truth is on this, Senator, that the birth rate in Canada is at an historic low. It's 1.45. I mean, just to have replacement levels, it's 2.1. Back in the early 1960s, when the average woman had 4 kids, childcare was that was a really burning issue. But today, it's we're not having kids at the rate that we used to do. So it's interesting that that's the government's response, but nonetheless, that's how they've decided to approach this.
Well, and it doesn't really help the people, where I live in smaller towns and rural communities, because they're depending on neighbors and family. I mean, there may be an exchange of cash, but daycare centers are not an answer for people in rural areas.
And also on this, but also on this issue, I mean, there's not going to be much for the government to show other than a commitment to provincial government and a desire to have this happen, there's not going to be new child care spaces opening up tomorrow. So it's, right. I understand from a communications perspective when you can't say something about the price of gas or you can't say something about the price of groceries, that you move on to something like this. But I doubt its communications effectiveness.
Yeah, you just think this is what people are living. And they're also on the government side. I mean, obviously, this is a huge issue if they decide to open that can of worms, and they just don't want to.
Well, this idea that you can go out and you can do a survey and you can find out that people care about childcare and it's roughly in the same category as cost of living, and saying, okay, well, I can substitute one for the other. There might be some wisdom that's related to that, but the backfire from all of this is people say, you're not listening to me.
Yeah,
you're not speaking to what it is that you're trying to distract me or tell me that something I should be caring about something else as a substitute for what I'm really caring about. Yeah. And I don't know too many times in which that sort of approach is successful.
I want to ask you about somebody else's work. I know that no pollster likes to do that, but prior to the election, the call of the election, the Privy Council office, or the Prime Minister's office, in that sense, they're there to serve him through the public service, went out and did a poll, 2,000 people roughly in Canada. They conducted what they described as psychographic polling, which showed, amongst other things, that Canadians trusted the cabinet and we're very angry with people who didn't follow pandemic rules and records. And I think, as the rules that were in place. I think we all know that. I mean, I sit on planes with people or I talk to friends and they want, they're mad at people who are not vaxxed because it's having such an impact on the healthcare system. It means, for example, in Saskatchewan, they shut down the transplantation program and things like that. So there really is a reaction. And so the government decided to use that as its core message, even though the day they called the election, Kabul was falling and lots of other things were happening. So were they right? Were they right to take those messages and work them through the campaign?
Well, first on the polling, there's nothing particularly novel about doing what they call psychographic polling. It's not real. It's just a poll that people analyze in a little more depth. That's all. Yeah. It's not anything special. And the revelations that came from that, well, there's things that anybody who deals with public opinion probably knew most of these things already. So I don't think there was anything especially revealing or, by the way, nefarious about doing that kind of polling. I mean,
no, of course they poll all the time.
Yeah, sure. So they poll all the time. But the idea that this election turned on what people thought about the pandemic, what was surprising in the election is how little a role it played. Now, that's a bit of a revelation, I think.
I'm going to say, what election were you watching?
Well, here's what I'll tell you. That when you ask people on surveys whether or not they thought the government had done a good job of managing the pandemic, the numbers were in the 60s.
Yeah.
They thought that they did. We asked about whether the Prime Minister had done a good job. His numbers were on managing the pandemic were actually really good.
Yep.
But that's not what the election turned on. The election, because if it did, then they would have done a lot better. I mean, they got 30, 32 in the end, and they were scoring in the 60s on those things. So it wasn't really about that. What it was really more about was the inability of the Conservatives to demonstrate that they were capable of standing in for this government and running not just the pandemic, but managing all the issues that were confronting the country or are confronting the country. So the national, the Liberal Party, scraped by in our first past the post system because they actually lost the popular vote because people really weren't prepared to make a change at this stage. But it wasn't because the Liberals cleverly focused on the pandemic. I mean, it was the number one issue. They didn't have to focus anybody. People were already talking about that. What was really surprising about the pandemic was it wasn't a bigger issue with the campaign. That was the bigger surprise because the Liberals were so far ahead on being able to best manage that issue. But
if that was the only issue, they should have done much better. Is
correct.
So it's really more. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with James Moore, former Conservative cabinet minister, and all of that, watches politics quite a bit, and he was citing some of the work you have done in the sense of, you kind of start on this scale, which is, the government calls the election, so it's a referendum on them, but it slowly becomes in the course of the campaign, okay, are the other guys ready? Are the other guys up to it? Did they win my vote? Have they convinced me? And the Tories sort of had it for a moment and then lost it as the campaign went on.
And that's all true. So what happened at the end of the campaign, in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, was when the Conservatives, the spotlight turned on them after the debate, and it was clear that the Liberals weren't doing as well. And actually, the fact that the Prime Minister didn't do very well in the debates worked for him in the following sense. What it did was it turned the lights on Aaron O'Toole, and people started looking at him very seriously. And the problem that he had in all of this was he was not able to convince the people in the Canadian electorate who really wanted the Liberals gone. He was not able to convince them that he could actually win, that the Conservative Party could actually win. So what ended up happening was people just kind of voted however they wanted to, because they didn't expect that the Liberal Party was going to lose anyway. So that's one of the reasons the People's Party, got 500,000, got 5% of the vote, because it was a free shot, because nothing was going to change. So rather than saying the Liberals won the election campaign because their management of the pandemic was so supported by Canadians, it was really more the dynamics that we're talking about now. And the reason we know that is because the Liberals were so far ahead on managing the pandemic. The funny thing for me in the election campaign was the day the election was called, it was almost like the public closed the door and said, okay, well, that's the government and that's that other stuff. Now we're going to evaluate the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party. As opposed to the government. So I think it's easy to get confused on what people think about the government's performance, which they thought very favorably of, compared to what they actually thought of the Liberal government and what they actually thought of the Prime Minister, which was very challenged. I mean, one of the things out of this, Senator, is that the Prime Minister came out a diminished politician from this election campaign. He's now gone through the full cycle of, darling to disappointment, which was 2019, to now, in large segments of the Canadian population, genuine dislike.
But still, it doesn't seem to matter what it is. And I don't want to dredge up all the old stuff, but I mean, the list is long, and there are scandals and there's blackface. And then to me, the thing that just was so dramatic was his trip to Tofino on the National Day of Reconciliation, which he had declared to be so fundamental and so key, in a sense, turning it into a holiday, which it's not supposed to be a holiday. It's supposed to be a day of remembrance and commemoration and forward looking and reconciliation. And I just don't know how that stuff sits. People just seem to go, oh, well.
Well, in terms of personal behavior and kind of sincere acts of contrition from the Prime Minister, even he would acknowledge that was not the smartest thing to do. And quite frankly, if he would have done it a week before the election campaign, it would have lost in the election.
Yeah, because it would have reinforced that notion. But afterwards, it's like,
which is baked in. People do not see him as a sincere political actor or as a sincere spokesperson on behalf of the government the way that they used to. I mean, as I said before, he's gone through the full cycle now.
Yeah. The other thing that is, of course, of interest to me because of my experience there and my history there, and to you because of your commitment to the military, is the whole issue of Afghanistan and our commitment to bring people here, the government's unwillingness to support this in any way. We've got former military people out there begging and pleading for money and raising money through philanthropic sources, but the federal government hasn't kicked in to live up to this commitment that we made to people who stood alongside our men and women. does anybody care? Are there like 5 of us in the world and that's it?
Well, I think that there are Canadians who do care about it. People, particularly Canadians who served in Afghanistan, probably care about this. People who follow the issues more closely. But the biggest effect that the falling of Kabul had on the election campaign was it distracted the Liberals from being able to deliver any sort of, I would say, affirmative message at the start of the campaign. And really take control of the momentum in the campaign right at the start. I mean, what was really ironic is similar to blackface in the previous election campaign. The way this election was called was almost like a stumble right out of the gates and falling down from the Liberal Party. They handed the Conservatives a gift. I mean, the Conservatives weren't even close. The Liberals probably had close to a double-digit lead at the start of that campaign that evaporated by the end of the first week. And where Afghanistan played into that was it was just one more thing that just didn't seem to be going right for the government. And the Prime Minister was asked about it every day of the election campaign. Got more questions on that than the 2 questions he got asked the most, which really showed what the problem was. 3 questions he got asked the most were, what the heck is going on in Afghanistan and what are you going to do about it? Second thing is, you still haven't given us a good reason as to why we're having this election. Right. Please tell me what it is. And then the third one was, so you're attacking the Conservatives on the issue of vaccines, but turns out that the Treasury Board's policy is the same as what the Conservatives have been putting up as their policy. So he got stuck with all of this stuff right at the very beginning that was very hard for him to break away from. And as a result, it was neck and neck in an election campaign that a week before it being called looked like a pretty sure Liberal, at least strong minority victory and potentially majority victory.
I guess I keep asking about this because, having just gone through Remembrance Day again, and it always troubles me. I see in my own hometown, the principals at the 2 schools are really good about keeping the kids engaged, even though there's not much you can do. But I read a story online the other day, and it just broke my heart. I don't know if it's true, but it certainly is representational that kids are not getting history. And when the navigator on the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb at Hiroshima in Japan, he was asked to come and speak at a school, and the teacher, not another student, but a teacher, stood up and introduced him as a veteran of World War XI, because nobody learns Roman numerals or anything anymore, and clearly hadn't done a lot of homework. I guess that's what troubles me about this issue, and that it doesn't really resonate. I mean, as you say, it did right at the beginning, but then it fell off the map.
Yeah, it did at the beginning and then fell off the map. And to the extent that anybody's hearing anything about the Canadian military today, it's about the woes of the Canadian military and dealing with its misconduct issues. So, which we've seen in our own polling has really had an effect on the reputation of the military in general, which is a sad thing, but it's true.
It has it? Like, that's
definitely. Well, when you hear about it ad nauseum, and the government, if it talks about anything related to the military these days, that's what it talks about. And as a result, what we've seen is a significant decline in the trustworthiness of the Canadian military. One of the things that had happened as a result of Afghanistan was that there had been a very significant increase in people's level of respect for the Canadian military. It was one of the only institutions that we saw through the course of the last decade in which their actual personal approval and trust levels went up. That's now come back down as a result of what's been happening lately.
So there's supposedly an apology coming from the federal government on this to all the survivors of sexual assault, and that seems a reasonable and just thing to do. I'm sure many of the victims want to hear that. We are, on the other flip side of that, hearing in a lot of these cases it's a case of guilty until proven innocent, that these are crimes, quote unquote, I'm using that word quite liberally there, that occurred 25, 30 years ago when people were young. And it's part of what we're going through everywhere in the culture, which is no explanation accepted or required. If there was any bad behavior judged by today's standards, then you're out on your ear. Is that approach acceptable to people? Are you getting any hint of that?
I don't get the sense that people know that there's a lot, that they don't have a lot of information about what's actually happening. What they're basically hearing about is what's been alleged as opposed to what's been proven. And, even, General Vance, he has his day in court coming up. So everything he's been accused of is still an allegation as well. But that's where the government probably did a very smart thing, which was to push this over to the civilian court system. So at least the military might not like the fact that that's happened, but if you want to legitimate what's the process for dealing with this, is the best way to do it. Because if it's done based on political whim, or the feeling that a minister has to manage the reputation of an institution, and so somebody ends up being punished as a result of that, as opposed to somebody being charged and convicted. I think the second version, which involves a trial process through a system that should not be biased about what the political implications might be for the government, is probably better for everybody.
And I'm sure you haven't polled on this, but I know you're interested in this issue. And so what do you think that means? I mean, there's I was reading just yesterday a discussion about the Americans want us to stand up a couple hundred people for peacekeeping, and they don't even have a response from Canada on that we're actually not doing anything out there in the real world. I mean, I know that's not true. We've got people stationed in many places in harm's way as well. But is there an appetite even for that?
I don't think that at this stage of the game, unless Canadians feel that there's a real crisis that needs to be dealt with, that there's a lot of desire to see our soldiers sent to any place in the world right now. The government has, I was recently at the Halifax International Security Forum, and I was on a panel, and somebody asked a question. She said, and this woman in the audience said, I've heard a number of people from the government talking about the Canadian military over the last couple of days, and this was the Sunday, so we've been all through it. And she said, she was an American. She said, I've heard about all sorts of things, but I haven't heard anything about the military and defense and security issues. It's this whole other series of issues that, they're talking about. So at some point, I mean, we're going to have to turn back to what the military's purpose is. I mean, why we have them, and what the security issues are that are facing the country, and how we do feel about the issues of defense, rather than these kind of internal management issues, but also other issues that are on the government's political agenda, things for everything, from climate change to, whatever you want to take a look at. But there are a series of things like China, Ukraine, a whole series of things.
in the Arctic and Chinese in the Arctic.
It's a whole series, but it was interesting to see this American just, really perplexed by the fact that she heard all of, these Canadian politicians talking about defense and security issues, but not once did they actually mention any real defense and security issues.
Well, that's part of the thing, and that we see, because they're being used domestically. So I think people are thankful and grateful when they show up in an old folks' home riddled with COVID, or if they put sandbags up in the East Coast or the West Coast, all across British Columbia, they're there. But that isn't their main job.
Well, it is interesting that when we are in a crisis, the place that we tend to turn, these types of crises, we turn to the military. But remember, these are people who spend their time on rifle ranges and, going around in tanks and, with warships out at sea. I mean, it's not the armed humanitarian agency. I mean, that's right. We should have another mechanism for doing that kind of thing. They don't need guns and jets and warships to be able to do those kinds of things. But so they have this other function as well. Also, it's the ability to demonstrate from the Canadian military their capabilities in all of these spaces. But it means all of these spaces, not just civilian interests. There's other things that are part of what the military does that they prepare for, and the institution is incredibly valuable, as we've seen even with the floods in BC. So yes, let's get things cleaned up internally. Let's make sure that we can get confidence back in the military, and particularly in terms of the military leadership. And let's start thinking about what Canada's defense and security policies are going to be going forward.
The polling, I just want to come back a full circle here on COVID. So now we're into this next variant of concern. And what is your sense from your ongoing polling of Canadians? Are they really at the end of their rope? How are we going to deal with a situation if we really hear governments say, let's lock it down, we're seeing it even in Parliament, we're going back to hybrid sessions and all of those things. I fear for the businesses, small particularly, but also medium and large in this country, of how they could deal with this again.
Yeah, well, what we're seeing in Canadian, polling Canadians, but also polling people around the world, is that the level of concern that we had 6 months or a year ago is not as high as it is now. And it's not that people can't be, based on the daily news, you can't get bumped up, but you can't stay at a 10 in terms of emotional fear forever. And so what's happened is people have now pushed out the horizon as to when this is going to be over. In some instances, in our polling, it's showing, a year or more in addition to where we already are. It's going to be even longer. So people are starting to factor these things into their lives. They don't like it, but they're learning to live with it. An awful lot of Canadians, the vast majority are already vaccinated, so they feel a certain amount of protection. Certain things are being, where certain aspects of our lives we're living closer to what we were living before. Now, if that changes again, some of these numbers will change. But and what it's doing is also opening up room for other issues to start to rise in terms of public importance, like cost of living. So I think what's happened is that people are still very vigilant. They're concerned, but they're not at a level of intensity that they were a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, you've got to say, obviously, it's here to stay. We have to learn to live with it, not retreat from it.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it.
And you think Canadians are there?
Yeah, I mean, it's what Canadians tell us in our research is that they are. So we, until now, we'd have to go back out this week and see what this new variant, what people are thinking. But last, a couple of weeks ago, we asked Canadians what were the most important issues facing the country, and COVID had dropped down to number 3. So, it could be coming back up a little bit, but given what's happening more recently, but. As I said before, there's space opening up for other considerations there.
For other issues. Now, I don't want to leave everybody with the thought that pollsters have no sense of humor and only deal with these
we don't.
Serious.
So that's fair. That's fair.
So how about polls on things like Christmas? Now, here's an IPSOS poll with asking questions like, what's acceptable and unacceptable? Returning a present that you do not like to the store. 56% said it's acceptable. 18% said it's unacceptable. What are these kinds of questions? Refusing to eat Brussels sprouts, obviously at Christmas dinner. 53% say that's acceptable.
Well, Brussels sprouts are an acquired taste, and I think I have to have a conversation with people about how to prepare Brussels sprouts.
Yes.
Yeah, and
I'm a fan of Brussels sprouts, so
me too.
I want them. Yeah,
me too. Well, we ask all sorts of things. Some of my favorite questions to ask are things like, "Do ghosts exist?" Or
what do you get?
About a quarter of the population think that they do. Disproportionately higher in places like India. Definitely, ghosts exist in India and in the United States. Women more likely to believe that ghosts exist than men. I mean, so you can go out and ask. One of my other favorite questions is: do you think that we will encounter, intelligent life from another planet over the space of the next year? You'll get 20% of the population will say, "Yeah, we likely will." So,
maybe they're just the optimists. Maybe they're just hopeful that we'll find intelligent life.
Somebody out there's got to know something. But I don't think every poll has to be about politics or
Yes.
serious things. I think it's really interesting to ask questions about, issues that you might ask at a cocktail party, right? So do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? And I think you get some pretty interesting answers.
Well, there was one that struck me: overspending on an agreed Secret Santa budget, right? So max $10, but you want your gift to be nice, or you drew the boss's name in the at work, and so people said no, that's unacceptable.
Absolutely.
Which is an interesting kind of moral thing, right? It's a moral question.
And Canadians are fairly rule-based, right? I mean, if you say that you're going to have a limit that you're going to spend, if you spend more than that, you're putting the other person in the bind, right? You're making them look. Yeah. So there's for anybody, it's all on our website. You can go take a look. You can go out and find out what people around the world think about ghosts and Christmas.
Now, this one was very close: 29% acceptable, 32% unacceptable. Colleagues having sex after their work Christmas party. So you actually got people to admit to this.
Yeah. It's anonymous, right? So people will tell you things. I mean, okay, so maybe some people were joking around and it's maybe half as much, but it's half as much.
Yes,
it's still an awful lot.
That was funny. Now, I also, of course, I follow you on Twitter, and you and I have many things in common, but one of them is we spend far too much time on airplanes, and you hadn't been on a plane for a while, so it provoked you to set out your rules again, because I know these are longstanding rules. And the most important one for me is people who come on a plane with a backpack and then swerve around to talk to their companion and then swerve the other way, hitting you in the head both times. Now, that's a pretty basic social rule, I think, that if you're wearing a backpack, you should be thinking about where it's going. It happens in stores and on buses and stuff too, right?
Yeah, except on a backpack, you haven't in a store, you haven't got somebody sitting at eye level,
right? So they're
through a long narrow, so you get it right in the head. Yeah, and I think some of it's just being polite, but other parts, when I tweet these things are just to make people's lives easier. I mean, so for example, don't take your coat if you're gonna in wintertime. Everybody takes a coat. If you're doing carry-on, leave enough room in your bag to put your coat. Because if you don't, you're going to end up sitting with it on your lap. And you're going to get upset because somebody's stuffing it above, in the overhead compartments. And you would think that that's where you should put them. But the flight attendants will tell you, no, we reserve those for people's smaller bags. Yeah. So, save yourself the trouble. You don't want to be sitting there sweating all day long and for the flight from Ottawa to Vancouver wearing your winter coat. But I see people do it all the time. One of my biggest pet peeve, the backpack drives me crazy. But the other one that drives me crazy is people bringing their ever so special, precious coffee on the plane. How many times have you seen that get spilled on people? I see it all the time. I've had it spilled on me. And it's like, they serve the damn stuff on the plane.
Yes.
You don't need to bring it on.
Right.
And it's hot. It's dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, so, don't carry a coffee. You won't
get your mocha, chai, blah, blah, double on the plane. And so
drink it before you get on. Drink it before you get on. I mean, and I will get people who, go back at me on Twitter and say, well, I'm allowed to, and I'm very careful. It's like, yeah, okay, so you're very careful. What if somebody stands up and you don't see them and your coffee is flying all over the place?
Yeah.
It's like people who take their dogs off of leashes in the park and say, well, my dog's different. Well, maybe my dog isn't. And maybe my dog's going to attack your dog, right? It's like we have these rules in place for a reason. It's about self-respect. It's about space. And on a plane where probably nobody wants to be, particularly these days with masks and all sorts of other things and all the inconveniences of being on a plane. Don't be a dope.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the other people who are on the flight.
to be serious about it for a moment, like people have been holding up at home for 2 years, and this probably is a good reminder. Like if you're going back out into the world, there are rules that you didn't have to follow at home. Like, yeah, you have to wear pants during a Zoom meeting or in real life meeting, but just these other things that we haven't been doing for a while. We need a reminder.
Well, another one that I will just say for your listeners is smartphones are wonderful things.
Yeah.
They're absolutely wonderful. They are not wonderful for boarding passes. They're not wonderful for vaccine certificates. They are not wonderful for proof of COVID tests. Right. So think of the following: your phone runs out of juice.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
The reader that they've got at Air Canada or they've got at security to read whatever it is that you have doesn't work properly.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Take hard copies of everything.
No, it's really true. I mean, I have got my QR code and all my stuff from Saskatchewan, but you know what? When I come to Ontario to go to the Senate, they can't read it in a lot of places. So you got to have.
And I see people get really freaked out, or they're standing there, and you think it's so convenient, and it's not, because half the time, it's not work. Half. It doesn't work. Or it takes longer than you think.
Yeah.
I mean,
and there's 200 people behind you in line.
and you see this too, the person going, oh. Yeah. Oh, I got to get the right thing. It's like, if you had it on a piece of paper and you just handed it to them, you'd be done. Instead, we have to watch you swipe left for the next 2 minutes. But the biggest thing I said, Senator, on the tweets was, pack your patience.
Yeah.
Everybody's under a lot of stress.
Yeah. Sure.
Even people like us who are frequent travelers, our travel muscles are flabby. We forget a lot of this stuff. And things that I've learned the hard way, because usually I'd be on the road 150 days a year, and I haven't over the last couple of years, and I got really, really good at traveling. And I noticed, this first trip I've had out of the country, not as good as that's what things I have to remember to do. So I was just trying to help out a bit.
Well, and if you're staying for more than 72 hours, you better get some other tests and whatnot, right? You've read all the rules.
I ordered the ones from that you could get from Air Canada, and I actually did in my hotel room today. I did my lamp test myself, so I can do my own tests. That's
great.
Yeah, you should order those.
I'm going to order those. Okay, little tip.
Yeah, I did it in my hotel room here in New York. They have a nurse from telehealth that comes on. You just have to take a picture of the test. They walk you through the whole thing. It's not like the one where you do swabs. You don't have to jam it all down back here. Yeah. It's just in the front of your nasal passage. And there's a different test to come back into Canada than there is to get in the United States. And they're all pretty easy. And it's really, really convenient.
Okay, that's great. Now I'm going to have to do that. Darrell, great. Thank you. I can't even remember where we started, but it was.
We always just talk like.
In another lifetime. Really good to see you. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all those things if I don't see you before.
I'm looking forward to speaking to you again. Have a great holiday.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Darrell Bricker, CEO of IPSOS, polling Canadians daily to find out what we really, really think. Thanks for joining us for this episode of No Nonsense. We'll talk again soon.